Hello, welcome to week 6. We're starting a new model, and this model is going to revolve around the media, especially the idea of media persuasion. And I'm going to start straight away with a video because I want to think through probably what it's maybe an exaggerated version of a media analysis. And this is the idea of thinking through the media as a propaganda model or as a tool of propaganda. And it could be a little bit shocking at first to think about the media in this way, but I'm gonna propose the following in order to deconstruct and especially take into consideration the idea of the media as a as a tool for mass persuasion. And in that sense, if we think about the media as a tool of mass persuasion, then we need to think about its propagandistic elements, right? So I'm going to play this video, and then I'll keep going with some of the theoretical underpinnings of this approach.
Now, if the press is a censoring organization, tell me how that works. You're not suggesting that proprietors phone one another up, or that many journalists get their copy spiked, as we say?
It's actually Orwell, you may recall, has an essay called Literary Censorship in England, which was supposed to be the introduction to Animal Farm, except that it never appeared, in which he points out, look, I'm writing about a totalitarian society, but in free democratic England, it's not all that different. And then he says unpopular ideas can be silenced without any force. And then he gives a two-sentence response, which is not very profound, but captures it. He says two reasons. First, the press is owned by wealthy men who have every interest in not having certain things appear. But second, the whole educational system, from the beginning on through, just gets you to understand that there are certain things you just don't say. Well, spelling these things out, that's perfectly correct. I mean, it's the first sentence is what we expand on.
This is what I don't get, because it suggests that, I mean, I'm a journalist, people like me are self-censoring.
No, not self-censoring. There's a filtering system that starts in kindergarten. It goes all the way through. And it doesn't work 100%, but it's pretty effective. It selects for obedience and subordination. And especially, I think that's...
So stroppy people won't make it to positions of influence.
Behavior problems, or if you read applications to a graduate school, you see that people will tell you he's not, doesn't get along too well with his colleagues. You know how to interpret those things.
I'm just interested in this because I was brought up, like a lot of people, probably post-Watergate film and so on, to believe that journalism was a crusading craft and that there were a lot of disputatious, stroppy, difficult people in journalism. And I have to say, I think I know some of them.
Well, I know some of the best and best-known investigative reporters in the United States. I won't mention names because I don't want to, whose attitude toward the media is much more cynical than mine. In fact, they regard the media as a sham, and they know and they consciously talk about how they try to play it like a violin. If they see a little opening, they'll try to squeeze something in that ordinarily wouldn't make it through. And it's perfectly true that I'm sure you're speaking for the majority of journalists who are trained, have it driven into their heads that this is a crusading profession, adversarial, we stand up against power, a very self-serving view. On the other hand, in my opinion, I hate to make a value judgment, but the better journalists, and in fact the ones who are often regarded as the best journalists, have quite a different picture, and I think a very realistic one.
How can you know that I'm self-censoring? How can you know that journalists...
I don't say you're self-censoring. I'm sure you believe everything you're saying. But what I'm saying is if you believe something different, you wouldn't be sitting where you're sitting.
Right. So really the most important part in this video clip is to think about the media as a filtering process, not so much self-censoring, but the different filters that one has to go through in order to get to a relevant position within the media. Therefore, what kind of general attitudes towards different camps in society, in politics, in economics, one has to have that relevant position, right? That position of persuasion, and that is the filtering system. So then we go into what Chomsky there in the interview and Edward Herman coined manufacturing consent. And it was a revolutionary book when it came to thinking about the media in different terms. And I'm using it because it's a very useful lens through which we can re-understand the media as beyond simply about, I was going to use framing, but it's not so much framing information as creating different discourses, informative discourses, and then we tend to think there is this tendency of thinking media communication as in different ideological camps. It could be left-leaning, right-leaning, right? But then when we think about the media as a whole, as a machine of manufacturing consent, even though I hesitate to fully accept the blanket statement that the media, in this case, the news media, is a machine of manufacturing consent. I think that the essence of this approach is an entry point to understand how the media is more than simply a communication tool that of information that could just simply come from two different unopposed ideological camps. In this sense, the media as a whole, regardless of the ideological spectrum through which the media self-reports to be, is an intrinsic part of how society is to must understand different worldviews, right? And in that sense, how different consensus can be manufactured. And one of the reasons why I don't fully accept the media as a manufacturing consent machine is because one of the most important aspects when it comes to the manufacturing of consent has to do precisely with popular culture and how popular culture recreates and creates different values and common sense attitudes. So I would even go beyond the media and I would ascribe this manufacturing consents to popular culture, especially entertainment, right? And that's in our previous block, we were talking extensively about that. So there are 5, but I think again, it's a very interesting point of access. It's an entry point in order to understand how different media communication technologies are not just either positioned onto different aspects of the ideological information spectrum, or even worse, and I'm going to say worse because it's a complete fallacy, that they're simply neutral communicative actors. And that's just simply a fallacy. As I will say in a second, because when it comes to media and comes to media messaging, persuasion is always involved, and when persuasion is always involved, neutrality is out of the window. In fact, I would argue that neutrality is always out of the window. I just simply I think there's more than enough evidence that neutrality, it's in and of itself an ideological position. But let's just go through the main 5 points when it comes to Herman's and Chomsky's propaganda model of manufacturing consent through in the media. And the first one has to do with the economics of the media, the idea that the media is owned by economic interest. It's owned by certain economic interest, and that ownership determines the type of information, the kind of information that is discussed, and especially more importantly, how that information is discussed. And here, framing, as we will see, it's an important tool. The second one has to do with advertising, because media companies are economic enterprises. Their main source of revenue is advertising. Therefore, it's not so much that media companies will go against their advertisers, although that is also could be certainly true. But it's not so much that precisely because the advertising industry is not simply just the advertising industry, it entails a whole consumerist capitalist logic of our economy in liberal democracies, right? And I forgot to mention that really this manufacturing consent, it only applies to liberal democracy. So what in other words could be called Western democracy, the Western world, really, which is a term that I really don't like, but just so as a shorthand, so we can understand each other. So as I was saying, because it's not so much the advertising industry or going against certain advertisers, because the advertising industry is a symptom of the larger economic model in which these media companies are inscribed, are part of, and in fact, they're drivers of this economic model. Therefore, because of that, the economic status quo will be in question. Not so much it will go against certain advertisers or companies. The status quo, the economic status quo, will understandably be in question, because it will be going against these companies' interests, these media companies' interests. And from the second point, the third point is derived. So the experts who analyze the status quo are limited in their framework by what's acceptable within that status quo, right? And if there is any divergence from those acceptable views espoused by these experts, there is different ways of dealing with that radical views, with that diverging views, and this is what they call flak, which comes from a German term that I don't know how to pronounce. It's the short term from a German word. And it's basically media disciplining. And this media disciplining, it includes a number of ways of marginalizing these views. Sometimes by, as I will say in a second, by including them within the status quo. We could go from just ideological ad hominem, just labeling something as radical, out there, politically crazy or unfeasible, right? This political partisanship, weaponization, etc. Right. Therefore, through this media disciplining, it's very clear what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. Right. So the limits of what's acceptable, it's always framed within the status quo, within the logics of liberal and capitalist democracies, right? So finally, through all these four different points, the last final point, it's established, and probably is the most important one. Then a dominant ideology is not only left unquestioned, it becomes a sort of national religion. And this is an exaggeration in a way, but it's a useful metaphor. It's simply taken as an act of faith that capitalism and liberal democracy it's not even that you can discuss the fitness or if it's fit for purpose or not. It is that it's never seriously deconstructed. It's never seriously questioned, and it's not repeatedly put into it is not up for discussion, basically, right? It's taken as common sense. Whether that's good or bad, it doesn't matter. The point is that these 5 points, what they actually are doing is creating different messages that are always taken for granted, that are hegemonic, as we are saying, that belong to the realm of common sense. Yeah. So now what happens, because remember that this manufacturing consent is really thinking very narrowly, in my opinion, about the news media in general, right? Then what happens when, after, especially in the 2000s, with the digital revolution? So then we have to take a more historical approach and see how the news media is transforming the digital revolution. And the transformation has to do with the promises, with the false promises, as we will see in a second in this video, of the digitalization of the media, and pretty much the demise of journalism. And in here, I'm thinking of news media in particular, but then everything that goes around the news media, so advertising, gets enhanced, right? In detriment of actual journalist reporting. And this is important because the part of the news media that was to be preserved, i.e., good faith information and good faith journalism and investigative journalism, gets diminished in favor of much more superficial, banal, trivial, and more dangerous way of communicating information. Yeah. So obviously, the ownership of media companies are they become basically monopolies, right? That then Murdoch Bezos, right? They not only that, but that there is a financialization of these companies. So, for instance, these media companies belong to much larger financial entities, and they're privately owned by these mega companies like Amazon's, for instance. The reliance on advertising is ramped up. Yeah. And the idea that the media is combative in its reporting is thrown out of the window, precisely because the dependence on power is much greater after much of the reporting was gutted out, as we will see in this video. So whenever reporters don't have the time to investigate, to report, then they relied on the sources of government, the sources of basically the powerful, of company owners, right? And so they become much closer to power, much more close than they were in the first place, right? Finally, precisely because this new model of the media is based on clicks, on getting as many clicks as possible, then self-reflection and self-criticism it's abandoned. The little that was left is basically completely abandoned by the big media corporations, right? What this tells us is that information that is supposed to be a public good in a democratic society, an open democratic society, has completely become a commodity, has been commodified. Now, I don't want you to have the impression that somehow the digital revolution caused the media to change completely, but it basically accelerated something that was already there to a greater to lesser extent, depending on which media you're talking about. So let's hear David Simon and his historical account of how the digital revolution has changed news media?
My name's David Simon, and I used to be a newspaperman in Baltimore. What I say will likely conflict with what representatives of the newspaper industry will claim, and I can imagine little agreement with those who speak for new media. From the captains of the newspaper industry, you may hear a certain martyrology, a claim that they were heroically serving democracy only to be undone by a cataclysmic shift in technology. From those speaking on behalf of new media, weblogs, and that which goes Twitter, you will be treated to assurances that American journalism has a perfectly fine future online and that a great democratization is taking place. Well, a plague on both their houses. High-end journalism is dying in America, and unless a new economic model is achieved, it will not be reborn on the web or anywhere else. The Internet is a marvelous tool, and clearly it is the information delivery system of our future, but thus far it does not deliver much first-generation reporting. Instead, it leeches that reporting from mainstream news publications, whereupon aggregating websites and bloggers contribute little more than repetition, commentary, and froth. Meanwhile, readers acquire news from aggregators and abandon its point of origin, namely the newspapers themselves. In short, the parasite is slowly killing the host. It's nice to get stuff for free, of course, and it's nice that more people can have their say in new media. And while some of our Internet community is rampantly ideological, ridiculously inaccurate, and occasionally juvenile, some of it's also quite good, even original. Understand, I'm not making a Luddite argument against the Internet and all that it offers. But you do not, in my city, run into bloggers or so-called citizen journalists at City Hall or in the courthouse hallways or at the bars where police officers gather. You don't see them consistently nurturing and then pressing sources. You don't see them holding institutions accountable on a daily basis. Why? Because high-end journalism is a profession. It requires daily full-time commitment by trained men and women who return to the same beats day in and day out. Reporting was the hardest and in some ways most gratifying job I ever had. I'm offended to think that anyone anywhere believes American monoliths, as insulated, self-preserving, and self-justifying as police departments, school systems, legislatures, and chief executives, can be held to gathered facts by amateurs pursuing the task without compensation, training, or for that matter, sufficient standing to make public officials even care who it is they're lying to or who they're withholding information from. Indeed, the very phrase citizen journalist strikes my ear as Orwellian. A neighbor who is a good listener and cares about people is a good neighbor. He is not in any sense a citizen social worker. Just as a neighbor with a garden hose and good intentions is not a citizen firefighter. To say so is a heedless insult to trained social workers and firefighters.
Right, so now we have the new media basically with the advent of the internet and the internet just becoming ubiquitous in our lives. Then there is a new model is created, a new model of persuasion. We can call it a new propaganda model, right? So what David Simon was there talking about is that transition when the old type of media persuasion, and in here I'm thinking news media, but also advertising and all these other type of media, whether it's film, all this type of entertainment, news, and media communication systems. The internet creates a new paradigm and exacerbates all the problems that we could see or we could deconstruct through Herman's and Chomsky propaganda model of manufacturing consent. That gets exacerbated in this new model. But this new model is new and different in some ways, in the sense that now consent is not so much manufactured, but consent, but is that dissent is controlled. And then there is the creation of hyperdiversity as a mean of controlling that dissent. And what do I mean by that? Is basically you flood the market of ideas with so many different diverging ideas that really only the dominant ideas that are repeated in these dominant media outlets are prominent. And then we have the perception, the false perception, that we have a the widest possible range of ideas, while what we have is simply a flooded market designed to control those dissenting ideas, and the dissenting ideas are, that have any relevance and in regards to the dominant ideas are simply lost in the flood. Then therefore political differentiation, what we think about the stratification of ideas, that's what I mean by political differentiation, it's simply a marketing strategy whereby different political opinions becomes a political identity, and they are disconnected from actual politics. So everyone can hold a different opinion. Therefore, the dominant political opinion is never truly questioned. So in that sense, I would argue that what we have now in this new propaganda model, it's this kind of a sports identification when it comes to ideas. It's partisan commentary. It's a flood of the market of ideas, and ultimately, and what we have is this carefully control of dissent through this niche politics, and this niche politics, precisely because of the nature of their marginal status, can never really rise to the top to truly question the hegemonic ideas. So the hegemonic ideas are left untouched. And when we get into the examples later in the following weeks, we're going to see how this actually happens, right? There is the appearance of diversity, but what is really happening is that it's an appearance. It's not only an appearance, but it's simply a flooding of ideas that never are truly explored, precisely because there are so many. Yeah, and that's how you get you can get radical views or so-called radical views in mainstream media. Precisely because they're radical, they're marginal, and they're just one of the many other radical views, and they can never seen as legitimate. Yeah. So that's sort of the state of media and how to approach media, and a very brief historical account of the old media as a propaganda model, as a model of persuasion, versus the new media, and the two differences. Now, what I want to get into now in the second part of this lecture is to how should we analyze those media messages. And there's two different ways. One is a quantitative analysis, and then we have it here on the right. And this is the one that you don't have the time to do because it requires the research of many different articles, different opinion pieces, different newspapers. So the gathering of data, there's simply not the time, right? So this is a descriptive approach in which data is gathered and described. What we're going to do is the qualitative research, an analytical approach to media. In that sense, there are three different levels: the discourse level, the rhetorical level, and the semiotic level. Right? In the discourse level, basically, we're thinking, how is this common sense, this manufacture? How these discourses make it into mainstream reasoning, right? How is basically the discourse of common sense created? At rhetorical level is within those discourses of common sense, yeah. What are the mechanisms that can create that create those discourses? What type of mechanisms of persuasion can be used to create this common sense? We're going to be looking at framing and reification. And finally, there is the third level, which we've been which we've done in the first block a little bit, which is the level of semiotics. And the semiotic is basically the study of symbolic communication. So what type of signs, especially visual signs and symbols, produce and reproduce more effectively these discourses of common sense, right? And basically, what other mechanisms of visual persuasion there are in order to create this common sense, right? And these are the three levels that I'm interested in, not so much the descriptive quantitative research, which is also, I'm putting it out here because it's very common when it comes to media studies, do this type of quantitative research. You know? So when it comes to discourse analysis, we need to think of discourse at the most basic level. It's simply written or spoken communication. Yeah. Now, this written and spoken communication has a representational character. So it's really a practice of representation that generate meaning. A practice of representation that generate meaning. So when we think of a practice of representation, we can think of how, for instance, different media discourses around family values, right? Media discourses about family values, different information that put the family at the center without questioning the idea of the family. And again, I'm not saying this is good or bad. It's an example of a discourse that gets enhanced through media communication. And it's a representational practice because we're representing is the family as the core of society, right? As the most basic unit in a society, as of a collective, you know, in a society, beyond the individual, right? So when it comes to discourse analysis, we need to deconstruct that practice of representation that creates the meaning, the representation of a family that create the meaning that the family is at the core, the most essential unit in a society, right? So we need to deconstruct and what is said, so what is said about that family, but also how it's said, and especially what is the context in which that what and that how takes place. That is, what are the social codes that generate these meanings? What are the different codes around the family that are used without questioning, that are able to generate a discourse of the family as the common sense of any, the most commonsensical unit that compose any society, yeah, beyond the individual, right? So we need to think how this discourse, in this case, let's say around the family, is generated, so historically generated, how then is circulated. If it's only through the media, can we see it in film? Can we see it in advertising? Can we see in what different contexts do we see this type of discourses, this type of communications? How is it internalized? So what are the mechanisms through which different commentators take the family for granted? And also, and finally, and very importantly, how these discourses are resisted. So who's resisting the discourse of the family as the most essential unit of any society, for instance? And Foucault here is an important, it's probably the theorist of discourse analysis, critical discourse analysis. And I'm going to give you the example of how the state used discipline of punishment. There is the family, but then think of another discourse that constitutes society. The most kind of essential aspect of society is the idea of disciplining and punishing subjects of the state, right? So let's hear Foucault's theory on this, and then pick out what kind of discourses are here, how this discourse is generated, circulated, internalized, and how could it be resisted? Yeah.
Next in Foucault's oeuvre came Discipline and Punish. Here Foucault did his standard thing on state punishment. Again, the normal view is that the prison and punishing systems of the modern world are so much more humane than they were in the days when people just used to be hung in public squares. Not so, argued Foucault. The problem, he said, is that power now looks kind, but isn't, whereas in the past it clearly wasn't kind, and therefore could encourage open rebellion and protest. Foucault noted that in the past, at an execution, a convict's body could become a focus of sympathy and admiration, and the executioner, rather than the convict, could become the locus of shame. Also, public executions often led to riots in support of the prisoner. But with the invention of the modern prison system, everything happened in private, behind locked gates. One could no longer see and therefore resist state power. That's what made the modern system of punishment so barbaric and properly primitive in Foucault's eyes.
So in here, what is happening under the discourse of disciplining and punishment, what is happening is the idea of the discourse of progress, society progress to be more kinder and overall just better to their subjects. It might be problematic. What is happening here really was discourse of progress is hiding and is through the concept of discipline and punishment, is that disciplining and punishment went from being public to being private. And therefore, one can argue that actually its progress is really not happening. It's simply discipline and punishment has been perfected to avoid resistance, right? So here is another discourse. And then therefore, for instance, the idea of the family that I was using before, we can think about how different ideas of the family have evolved throughout the centuries to go to have a very similar discursive mechanism. Families were about transactions, for instance, were collective transactions between that form small communities, right? Then therefore marriage was a transaction, and now it's become a matter of the self, a matter of like romantic love. You create family through romantic love, a more private, individualistic, and I would argue capitalistic way of thinking, or post-capitalist way of thinking the family, in which you invisibilize the economics of the family in order to focus on love. Love creates the family. Therefore, you devoid, empty out the public economics of the family that used to take place. And again, this is not that before was better or a more positive view of the family, and now it's a more negative view of the family. Is that you look at the discourse around the family and you can see this thing underlying the progress of the family. So the same thing goes with discipline and the discipline and punishment, right? This idea of progress from public to private. So the second level is the rhetorical analysis. And the rhetorical analysis is basically looking at media messages as messages of persuasion and the different mechanisms that we have to influence what and how audiences think and feel. So not only just think, but feel. So the what and the how and emotions, right? And then there's two main points when it comes to rhetorical analysis. So these media messages are what construct a certain media discourse, right? So there's the media discourse at the top, then there's the media messages, and these media messages has different tools to construct their messages of persuasion, right? To persuade the audiences into not so much what to think, but how to think, and especially how to feel about what we think, right? So emotions here are also important. So we're gonna think about two main ones. There are more than just this, but the most important ones to me are the idea of reframing and framing, right? And And basically frames are how different in a message, in a given message, how the information in that message is selected to influence people on how to think and also feel, I would say, about any given issue. It's not what to think, it's how to think. In that sense, frames really organize the way common sense can be constructed. And the point of framing is that it's not explicit. It's not explicit bias, but it's an implicit bias. It's an implicit process of communication. In that sense, journalists tend to reproduce frames by selecting the frames that resonate with the culture in which they're operating, with the culture and the status quo that they are filtered not to question. And they simply produce and reproduce and produce these frames, this way of constructing common sense, these ways of creating messages that select pieces of information to persuade the public about their own view of a certain issue that coincides, and that often, that especially in mainstream media, that coincides with the range of what is accepted by the status quo. And remember, here is the range of what is accepted. You could have different views and very different views, but those different views in media discourse are framed within what is acceptable, and what is not acceptable is oftentimes labeled as radical, marginal, out there, crazy politics, right? Think about immigration, for instance. Immigration is often framed within this otherized paradigm. Immigration is basically looked upon as the product of victimization. These immigrants are usually victims in their own countries. They need to be treated well in the host country because of their suffering, or from the other viewpoint, the contrary viewpoint, they're dangerous, disruptive foreigners that come to disrupt the well-being of the host nation. However, we never really think, or is never really, immigration is rarely framed as a product of geopolitics, especially a product of empire. And when we start looking at immigration as a product of empire, which is, in my opinion, a much more productive and effective and truthful kind of immigration, then we see how all these other two frames around immigration, it's simply a question of media framing. So just a minute of how actually the ones that the immigration history that I know best is the immigration of Latin America to the US. So I'll just play a little clip around the Nicaraguan immigration into the US and the Iran-Contra issue, and how it created the immigration that we see today. And in fact, all the gang problems that we see from all the gangs that were product of the Nicaraguan Contras and also the Salvadoran Contras, and that gangs are plaguing California, for instance, today, are a direct consequence of the CIA intervention in El Salvador and Nicaragua.
The Iran-Contra scandal was huge and should have been much bigger. What the United States decided to do was to open up ties to Tehran by selling them surface-to-air missiles. The profits of those sales were then put into banks in Switzerland and were removed to pass to the Contras, who were trying to overthrow the Sandinistas. What Iran-Contra represented at the very heart of the problem was to ignore American law. American law clearly stated that the United States was not allowed to provide military assistance to the Contras. And American law also stated that we weren't going to do business with governments such as Iran that were involved with terrorist actions. The instability that we have contributed to creates the kind of chaos and disarray that leads to more immigration. Because you can argue that if we move into these societies and contribute to this dysfunction, we have a moral obligation to help the people who feel unsafe in the situations that we, in part, have created.
Right. So immigration is really the product of geopolitics, and especially interventions in other countries. Right? And we look at this historically, that framing of immigration that we usually get from media communication, the discourse on immigration as victim or disruptor, foreign disruptor, alien disruptor, could be reframed to think about immigration as a geopolitical issue, right? Then the thing that of the consequence of the consequence of successful media framing is reification. And simply reification is when an idea or a concept like immigration in the abstract, that is not in the specific context of immigration, i.e. not the immigration from Mexico into the US, not the immigration from sub-Saharan Africa into Europe. Immigration in general, it's framed successfully and then becomes reified. It eventually passes natural, i.e. people leave their country to look for a better life, in search of a better life, and host countries are this wealth, source of wealth that immigrants are searching desperately for. Yeah, that is the refi version of immigration, as opposed to think of immigration as a direct product of geopolitics. People don't move countries unless there has been they don't move countries just because they want a better life. They move country as consequence of geopolitical events. As you can see in the history of Latin American immigration. And if you want to know more about that, there's a book titled Harvest of Empire, and a documentary from which the previous clip was extracted from, that really explains how geopolitical interventions in Latin America created the Latino population in the US, right? Most of it. So think about the way we think about the family. As I was saying before, the idea of the family has been reified. The family, as we think, is becoming the legal yardstick where we, for instance, with the law measures everything else. Yeah, we don't understand society without the family, and that is a product of different discourses, family discourses that are successfully framed, not only in the media but throughout the history of different societies, and therefore has become reified. Now, think about how the battle around gay marriage changed that reified discourse of the family as and especially the traditional family as an institution of Western society, right? That what the debate around gay marriage did was broke the traditional reified, the established reified discourse of the family, and reframed it, successfully reframed it. So it's a question of framing and reframing here, and didn't really debunk the very concept of traditional family. It included other aspects, right? Because the family, it's reified not only through media, but through many other cultural aspects, right? Okay, so finally we have the semiotic analysis. I don't have much time to look at this, but to me, this is something that we've been doing in the first block, which is really the study of symbolic communication and how we can decode different visual text. And the decoding here, visual text, and this is last, especially when we're dealing with media, we're going to be dealing with visual text. So with the decoding of visual text is basically done through the relationship between what is seen and unseen, what is in the foreground and the background, what is visible and it's invisible. That is the relation between denotation and here, as you can see, connotation, right? So denotation is explicit. If you think about a glass, it's simply an artifact to see better, to help you with vision, to aid your vision. But it suggests intelligence, right? That's the connotation, depending on different contexts, right? So let me just put this back in there. Okay, cool. So through this relationship of what is denotative, what is explicit, what is connotative, what is implicit, what can be read between the lines in visual text, different social myths can be created. And these myths create and recreate, create new and recreate all political meanings. And when I say political meanings here, I'm talking about politics, but I'm also talking about the hierarchy of ideas. What is and how different ideas are more prominent and how others are much less prominent, because politics always implies a hierarchy and a structure, a hierarchical structure, and that's also another definition for politics, the hierarchy of ideas and the relationship between those ideas. It could be also thought about as politics beyond what we think about politics in electoral politics or social movements, so on and so forth, right? So semiotics then analyzing these meaning-making processes of how a given truth, right, how that common sense is seen or appears to be the only true message, right? The idea of immigration as just a question of victims and foreign disruptors, right? Rather than one of the many other possibilities. So again, here, I'm not saying that immigration's geopolitics is the true message or that needs to be reframed as a true message. It's simply that immigration is, as victims of foreign disruptor, appears to be in media, is shown in media as the only true message. It's seen as common sense, and it's not just one of the many other possible alternatives. And this advertisement about this Italian goods tells you a lot about, for instance, how this denotation of connotation works, right? What you see here is different, very artificially wrapped Italian produce, but then this net and this fresh produce around the artificially packed plastic suggests that Italian food has to do with this the home cooked type of meal, with this with this natural organic food and kind of back to the roots type of cuisine, right? So that is what is connoted as opposed to what is denoted, which is simply products and advertisements, right? So through that, we can see the different hierarchies of ideas, right? In this visual analysis, a very quick and brief visual analysis, because I'm really running out of time. And here I'm not going to play this because I'm running out of time. So there is the idea of decoding science. If you play this clip in your PowerPoint, then you can see a bit of more a really visual explanation of how Roland Barthes, the father of semiotics, understood science as social myths. Yeah. I'm gonna end looking at another sort of another case study. So I talk about the family, I talk about immigration, how it can get code and decode. But think about something that was very important in media not so long ago, that this idea of panic buying and how panic buying was framed in order to connect with discourses of how society is understood in our status quo. Because if you think about panic buying, the way it was framed, it was an issue around selfish and unselfish people. Yeah, and then between the lines was those selfish people that were panic buying were ignorant versus the unselfish people who understood how society works and understood the orders of the government, that were intelligent. That is, was irrational versus rational. And what they were saying is really under the discourse in that frame, in how that message was framed, the discourse there was that really so society needs to be monitored because you always have these selfish, ignorant, irrational people, and then you need to have these government controls for these people not to do these things that are negative for a society overall, and this thing meaning panic buying. So panic buying was just a symptom on an overall discourse that society needs to be controlled, right, from the top. That was the implicit, if you really look into that. Right now, if you actually try to reframe that, and then visually you can see how and then finally the third level, so we have the discourse. Basically, society needs to be controlled from the top, right, because we need to be the unselfish people need to be protected for the selfish people. So who's going to do that? Basically the government has to do that to keep the peace, right? And the different framing was that the framing of this under that discourse in this case was the idea of panic buying, right? The discourse with people panicking, they're buying and they're being irrational. And now visually, you can see if you go back to how then this news were visually framed, you can clearly see the different signs that reinforced those messages and that discourse. So that would be the last level, that with the semiotic level, right? The visual signs in the news, right? So the images that accompany that. But however, we look at why that happened actually, from the point of view of economics and from the view of social psychology, is not at all irrational or unselfish. It could be reframed as basically that's the way supermarkets work, in a very specific way, by which the profits are done through quick selling of limited supply. So they're not required to stock in produce for long periods of time. So they cannot be put back on the shelves when they're gone, this produce, right? So the way they make their money, the type of economics around supermarkets, has to do precisely with the idea of not having to have a storage facility, because they depend on a constant supply of produce. When that supply is disrupted, and then they cannot replenish the produce as they used to do. So it's not so much that people are panic buying, is that supermarkets' economic model is failing to what is a rational demand. And as we will see now with how the social psychologist Clifford Stock actually argues that this demand, high demand of produce during COVID lockdown was very rational. Really here, then we start seeing a different way of reframing that message that could rethink the overall discourse that society doesn't really need to be that controlled, but that the problem that we may be having here is more systemic and has to do with the way society is economically organized, right? And in fact, what seems to be irrational is very much rational at that time. So let's end with the explanation of Clifford's thought around the idea of panic buying. Okay. Let's see if this plays. Just 1 second. If not, I'll just play it outside. Okay, let's just play it outside.
It makes us think that other people are behaving in selfish ways. It makes us think that other people are behaving in selfish ways, which leads us to think, oh, well, we need to go out and get that fuel, because if we don't, they will, and I'll be left without any fuel. So the key point about that is a kind of logic. It's got a logic to it, and it's not really about panic. It's about dependency, that people are buying the fuel because they need it. And they know that if they don't get that fuel, that they are going to be left without it, and therefore they won't be able to go about their normal business, they won't be able to go shopping, they won't be able to go to work, and so on. So it's really important that we understand it as an increase in demand, not a product of panic. It's actually increased level of demand at a time where the supply chains have been weakened through various different factors, one of which is the shortage of HGV drivers, but the other, of course, is Brexit, the other is pandemic, the other is the lack of investment in the industry over decades by successive governments. So those are much more sensible ways in helping us to understand what's causing the problem than blaming each other for why it's happening. And for me, that's kind of what the problem is that it's not about us, it's not about each other, it's actually about failures of governance that we really need to be addressing. It makes us
right. So it's failures of governments, failures of the system, systemic issues, not about different individuals, but that, right? So for the tutorial, I want you to do something different. So I want you to actually look at these two articles here, Branding Real Social Change and Consuming for the Greater Good. I want you to pick one of those and analyze how either the concept of real beauty here in Article 1 or the concept of wokeness is constructed in the media, right? So through this article, think about how it's constructed in the media, and think about the media in general terms, not just the news media, but advertising, sports, films, right? Then make sure that you have at least 3 passages, that you pick at least 3 passages to back up that analysis. And now finally, think of the different political ramifications that these constructions have. Okay, so and here you have the background bibliography, so some other articles that can help you thinking through the different concepts that I explained in this lecture, and that's all for